It is generally well recognized that not all of our manuscripts are early. It is clear from this distribution that although there are a good number of early manuscripts, the bulk are still considerably late, with a sizable percentage being lectionaries. Furthermore, this first millennium window represents only a fraction of the total amount. If there are approximately 5,300 manuscripts in total, 83% of them come from the year 1000 or later. This does not mean the number of manuscripts from the 2nd to 10th centuries is insignificant. Clearly, the New Testament is well attested in this period. Rather, it is intended to be the first step toward putting the many thousands of manuscripts into proper perspective. The next step is to understand what these manuscripts actually contain. There are just over 60 manuscripts of the whole New Testament. This leaves the other 99% containing only portions of the text. The standard divisions of the New Testament in the manuscript tradition are the Gospel, Acts and the Catholic Epistles, the Pauline Epistles, and Revelation. It is very common to find the Gospels transmitted alone, and Acts and the Catholic Epistles together, with the Pauline Epistles, but these are hardly rules, and almost any combination can be found. The following chart shows how well the various sections are represented in the first millennium, with a separate column for the lectionary count. The important point here is that when speaking of the 889 manuscripts from the first millennium, there are not 889 complete New Testament manuscripts. Indeed, while the Gospels are numerically well represented, the manuscripts containing other parts, especially Revelation, are a small fraction of the total. Breaking these divisions down by century is also helpful, lest we forget that most of these are not early. And the numbers in second figure are biased toward the earliest possible date for each manuscript. Even these numbers need to be put into proper perspective. What does it mean to have X number of manuscripts for a particular part of the New Testament? Just as 889 New Testament manuscripts from the first millennium does not mean 889 complete New Testament manuscripts, 158 manuscripts of the Pauline Epistles still does not mean there are 158 manuscripts of that entire corpus. Furthermore, it does not mean that even an entire epistle is contained in a manuscript. On the extremes, Codex Sinaiticus contains the whole New Testament, whereas P12 has parts of a single verse from Hebrews. So, how complete is the earliest witness to some books? Of the Gospels, Mark is numerically the least attested, and the following chart shows how much is preserved prior to the 4th century as percentages of each chapter. The only manuscripts of Mark from this period are P45, which is absent for 78% of that Gospel, and P137, which contains only parts of 6 verses from Mark 1. John, on the other hand, is very well represented in this earliest period. John is found in several significant early manuscripts, P45, P66, and P75, that cover the majority of the Gospel, and then several smaller ones that fill in the gaps. Only 14 verses in the whole Gospel do not find a witness in this period as seen in this chart. The point here is not to cause despair about books such as Mark but to point out that not all manuscripts are equal when it comes to early attestation, and that even when a section, the Gospels, has numerous manuscripts, it does not mean that every Gospel has equal representation or that what exists is early and complete. When speaking of the 5,300 manuscripts of the New Testament, these clarifications of the data are the types of things that must be taken into account. The bulk of manuscripts are late, and not everything is represented equally. The Gospels have many manuscripts, while Revelation has very few. Within the textual tradition of each book, some, such as John, have a high percentage preserved early, while some, such as Mark, have considerably fewer in the earliest period. Furthermore, all of the above caveats are secondary to the quality of the manuscripts being counted. Not all of these manuscripts contain texts we would trust or that the scribe necessarily copied well. I want to offer a few points about how to approach and make use of the number of manuscripts in teaching, apologetic, or in any context dealing with non-specialists. As an overview, the evidence should not be made to say more than it can, and it is crucial to be honest about problem areas in the evidence. If the internet age has taught us anything, it is that people can and will uncover gaps, manipulation, and dishonesty with the data if they are present. Christians, therefore, should be extra careful. The first point is that bigger numbers do not necessarily equate to better evidence. The reality is that many manuscripts have no noticeable impact on scholarship or critical editions, let alone on, say, English Bibles. There are two ways to interpret the number of manuscripts responsibly when it comes to the reliability of the New Testament text. On the one hand, a large majority of manuscripts are text-critically unnecessary for establishing the original text, producing no more noticeable effect than a pebble dropped in the ocean. On the other hand, it is precisely this lack of effect that is important when judging reliability. If the bulk of the papyri discovered at the beginning of the 20th century, and all other manuscripts since then have not resulted in major revisions of our critical editions, then this attests to a remarkably stable text that can reliably be reconstructed even without them. The typical newly discovered manuscript is therefore likely to be both statistically insignificant and confirmatory of a reliable text. It is important to note that confirming a text as reliable is distinct from making it more reliable. The latter is certainly reliant on the manuscript evidence, but when manuscripts cease contributing new information, it is dependent wholly on method. The second point is to be content with round numbers. Using round numbers is prudent for a couple of reasons. All of the complicating factors outlined above make attempts at precision a needlessly tedious task that is almost certain to end in error. Even 5,300 is potentially generous. If the rate of error in cataloging the majuscules is consistent for every category of manuscripts, then 5,100 is a better approximation. The reason for bumping up the number to 5,300 from 5,100 is that minuscules and lectionaries are less affected than majuscules by the problem of double counting. This is because they tend to be less fragmentary, and therefore there is less likelihood that two or more pieces might be held in different libraries and be given different GA numbers. However, minuscules and lectionaries are still subject to fires and floods, being misplaced, being sold into obscurity, and being incorrectly added to the catalog. Returning to why using a round number is sufficient, it needs to be remembered that finding one more minuscule is not going to convince someone Christianity is true. Be clear about manuscripts' limited apologetic value. This brings us to the final point, which is the importance of understanding what manuscripts can and cannot do. In the negative, manuscripts alone cannot prove the truth of Christianity. What manuscripts can do is provide evidence of a reliable text. A reliable text attested by thousands of manuscripts is just that, a reliable text. But a reliable text is not a guarantee of reliable content. Just as a reliable text of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War still requires interpretation and verification to assess its historicity, so does the New Testament. Having a reliable enough text is undoubtedly important, because without it arguing for the accuracy of its material would be impossible. Yet providing arguments for the trustworthiness of a text's actual claims is not something with which textual criticism can help. Those types of important arguments must come from other fields of inquiry. My hope is that this video has been helpful for understanding the challenges faced when dealing with the number of New Testament manuscripts. Textual criticism appears to be more popular than ever, and promises to stay at the forefront of many apologetic contexts. Accordingly, anyone working in this area must be aware of the issues, and must deal with them honestly and with the required nuance.